The city was quiet but tense. As the sun began to rise over the walls, soldiers looked out from the towers with worried eyes. They could see the enemy army far away on the horizon. The ground shook slightly with the sound of hundreds of boots marching toward them. People in the city whispered to each other in fear. Mothers held their children tightly, and fathers tried to calm their families. Everyone wondered if today would be their last day. The enemy army was known for its strength and ruthlessness. No one had ever defeated them in battle. The city leaders gathered in the main hall. Their faces were pale with worry. They argued about what to do and who to send to stop the army. Everyone felt helpless because there was no army strong enough to fight this force. Suddenly, the gates opened and a figure appeared on the horizon. A small carriage rolled through the city gates, and a crowd began to gather. Their eyes widened as they saw who had arrived. The diplomat had come alone, but he did not come empty-handed. Behind him stood a human bodyguard. The bodyguard was tall and strong, but carried no weapons. People stared in confusion. How could one human protect a diplomat against such a huge army? The diplomat walked calmly toward the city center. His clothes were clean, and his face showed no fear. Soldiers whispered to each other, but no one dared to ask him anything. The diplomat stopped and turned to face the enemy army. Everyone held their breath. The bodyguard stood behind him, silently watching the soldiers with sharp eyes. The wind blew through the square, and the flags moved slowly. It was a quiet moment, but filled with tension. The enemy commander raised his hand to signal an attack, but then hesitated. Something about the human bodyguard made him pause. The soldiers on both sides noticed the sudden silence and looked around in surprise. The diplomat said nothing, but his eyes shone with confidence. The bodyguard moved slightly forward. His steps were light, but strong. People could feel the power in his presence. The crowd gasped in awe and fear. Could a single human really stop this army? They watched as the enemy soldiers exchanged nervous glances. The tension grew thicker by the second. Children clung to their parents, and soldiers tightened their grips on their weapons. Every heartbeat seemed loud in the quiet city square. The diplomat lifted his hand slightly, and the bodyguard took a small step forward. The enemy commander frowned and signaled to his troops again, but hesitation remained. The soldiers felt unsure for the first time in years. The city leaders looked at each other with hope that had not been there before. The bodyguard did not speak or shout. He only watched carefully and moved like he was ready for anything. The diplomat's calmness seemed to give him more power, and the city began to whisper with excitement. Could they really survive this day? The enemy soldiers noticed the whispers, and the pause grew longer. There, commander looked nervous. The bodyguard's eyes scanned the enemy army with precision. Every soldier felt as if he could see right through them. The crowd began to hold their breath as the tension grew to its peak. Suddenly, a small group of enemy scouts moved forward, thinking to test the human bodyguard. They thought one human could not be dangerous. The bodyguard moved like lightning, and in a single motion, he disarmed them and knocked them down without hurting them seriously. The crowd gasped and stepped back in fear and amazement. The diplomat's eyes glowed with a small smile, but he said nothing. The enemy commander frowned deeply. The pause in the army became longer. Soldiers began to wonder if they should really attack. The city held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The sun rose higher, and the shadows of the diplomat and his bodyguard stretched long across the square. Everyone watched closely, as if the next moment would decide the fate of the city. The diplomat took a step forward, and the bodyguard followed silently. The enemy soldiers froze in confusion. The commander tried to shout an order, but his voice trembled. The crowd in the city square began to whisper, and hope and fear mixed together. Could a human really hold back an entire army? The diplomat and the bodyguard walked slowly toward the center of the square. Soldiers on both sides could not move. Their eyes were glued to the human bodyguard, who seemed calm but powerful. The city leaders prayed silently. Mothers clutched their children tightly, and fathers looked on with awe. The air felt heavy with tension. The enemy commander looked uncertain for the first time ever. His face showed fear that he had never known before. The diplomat raised his head high and looked toward the enemy army as if nothing could harm him. The bodyguard stood behind him like a shadow, waiting for the right moment to act. The city held its breath in silence, waiting to see what would happen next. The enemy soldiers shuffled nervously. The commander raised his hand again, but then stopped. The pause lasted long enough for everyone to feel the weight of the moment. The diplomat did not speak, but his calm presence filled the square with power. People could feel that something extraordinary was about to happen. The human bodyguard stood silently scanning every soldier and movement. The city square was tense and quiet, but full of anticipation. Everyone wondered if a single human could really change the course of the battle. The enemy army moved closer, and the ground shook under their feet. The city square was filled with a heavy tension. Soldiers on both sides watched carefully. Citizens held their breath and whispered prayers. No one moved, but everyone could feel the danger coming closer. The diplomat stood tall in the center, and the human bodyguard remained behind him, quietly observing the approaching army. The bodyguard's eyes scanned each soldier like he could see every thought in their minds. The enemy commander raised his hand again and shouted orders, but the human bodyguard did not flinch. The crowd in the city square felt the power of the human presence. Even from a distance, the diplomat took a slow step forward, and the bodyguard moved in perfect sync behind him. The enemy soldiers hesitated because something about the human bodyguard made them uneasy. Their confidence began to fade. The commander frowned and signaled a small group to test the human bodyguard again. This time, 3 soldiers stepped forward, thinking to challenge him. They believed they were strong enough to scare a single human. The human bodyguard moved before they could reach him. His movements were smooth and fast. He disarmed one soldier with a twist of his hand. He knocked another to the ground with a precise kick. The third soldier stumbled back in fear and confusion. The crowd gasped at the speed and control of his actions. The diplomat's face remained calm and almost proud, but he said nothing. The enemy commander noticed his men falling so easily, and his confidence started to crack. The city leaders exchanged looks of hope. For the first time in many months, mothers held their children tighter, but their faces showed amazement. Fathers whispered quietly to each other about what they were seeing. The enemy soldiers began to hesitate and shuffle in place. They had never faced anything like this. The human bodyguard did not strike again. He stood perfectly still, but his eyes never left the enemy soldiers. They felt as if someone was reading their thoughts and predicting their every move. The diplomat raised his hand slightly, and the human bodyguard took another small step forward. The enemy commander swallowed hard and looked at his troops for reassurance, but found none. His soldiers were frozen in fear and doubt. The city square was silent, except for the sound of heavy breathing and distant footsteps from the army. The diplomat took a deep breath, and the human bodyguard shifted his weight lightly, as if ready to act at any moment. The enemy soldiers began to whisper among themselves. Their morale started to crumble because they could see that one human was enough to stop them. The city citizens stared in awe. They could not believe how one human could hold the power of an army. The enemy commander clenched his fists. He had never felt fear like this in his life. He tried to shout again, but his voice faltered. The soldiers looked at each other with nervous eyes. Some began to drop their weapons slowly. The diplomat did not move or speak, but his calm energy filled the square with power. The human bodyguard remained behind him like a silent shadow, ready to defend or attack at a moment's notice. The crowd could feel the tension rising higher and higher. The sun beat down on the square, and the shadows of the diplomat and the bodyguard stretched long across the ground. Citizens whispered in disbelief. Could one human really stop an entire army? The enemy commander took a deep breath and motioned to his men to hold back, but his face showed panic. The human bodyguard's eyes did not move from the soldiers in front of him. Each breath and movement of the enemy army was noticed immediately. The diplomat nodded slightly to the human bodyguard, and he stepped forward a little more. The soldiers froze completely in fear and anticipation. The city leaders held their hands together in silent prayer. Their hearts raced with hope and fear at the same time. The children clung to their parents, whispering about the amazing human who seemed unstoppable. The enemy commander tried to regain control, but he could not. The human bodyguard's presence alone made the enemy unsure of their strategy. Soldiers began to lower their weapons slowly, without being told. The crowd gasped and whispered excitedly. The diplomat raised his head higher, and the human bodyguard mirrored his calm and confident posture. The enemy commander's eyes widened as he saw more soldiers hesitating. The city square was filled with tension, but also a strange feeling of relief. People realized that the human bodyguard was more than strong. He was something extraordinary, and no army, could match his focus or power. The diplomat and the human bodyguard stood silently, while the enemy army seemed to pause completely. Every heartbeat in the city square felt loud and heavy. The citizens waited for what would happen. Next, the diplomat moved his hand slightly, and the human bodyguard took another small step forward. The enemy commander's face turned pale. He did not understand how one human could have such control over the battlefield. The soldiers exchanged nervous glances, and some even whispered to their comrades about surrender. The crowd watched in disbelief. The city leader's hope grew stronger. The tension was unbearable, but also thrilling. Every person in the square felt that the fate of the city was about to change. In an instant, the human bodyguard did not speak or shout. He only watched the enemy army with calm precision. The diplomat did not move either, but his eyes were fixed on the commander, waiting for the right moment to act. The city square was silent and heavy with anticipation as everyone waited to see if one human could really stop the approaching army. The city square was tense as the enemy army froze in place. Soldiers looked at each other, nervously unsure if they should attack or wait. The diplomat stood calmly in the center with the human bodyguard behind him. The crowd held their breath as every eye was fixed on the two figures. The enemy commander felt a strange fear. For the first time in his life, his soldiers hesitated and shuffled their feet in confusion. The human bodyguard did not move much, but his presence alone seemed to control the battlefield. The diplomat raised his hand slightly, and the human bodyguard took a step forward. His movements were smooth and calculated, like he had done this many times before. The enemy soldiers whispered among themselves. Their confidence was slipping fast. The city citizens held their hands together and stared wide-eyed. They could feel something extraordinary was about to happen. The human bodyguard's eyes scanned the battlefield carefully. He noticed a group of soldiers who tried to flank the diplomat. They thought they could strike quickly before anyone noticed. The human bodyguard moved faster than anyone could see. He intercepted them before they reached the diplomat. Each move was precise and controlled. He disarmed one soldier with a twist of his arm. He pushed another back with perfect timing and knocked a third to the ground without serious harm. The enemy soldiers gasped at the speed and skill. They had never seen anything like it before. Some of them dropped their weapons in fear. The crowd watched in disbelief. Some whispered, "Is he really human?" The diplomat remained calm and proud, but said nothing. The enemy commander's face turned pale. He could not believe his soldiers were falling so easily. His confidence was gone. The city leaders whispered to each other in hope and amazement. Mothers held their children tightly, but could not stop staring at the human bodyguard. Fathers whispered quietly about how one human could be stronger than an army. The enemy commander tried to shout orders, but his voice trembled. The soldiers looked at each other nervously, and some began to step back. The city square was filled with tension and silence, except for the sound of breathing and distant footsteps. The human bodyguard moved with perfect control. He did not attack aggressively. He only defended and stopped the soldiers in their tracks. The enemy soldiers felt trapped and unsure. The diplomat lifted his hand slightly again, and the human bodyguard stepped a little closer to the center. His calm energy seemed to fill the square with power. The citizens could feel the change in the air. They began to whisper excitedly. The enemy soldiers exchanged nervous glances, and some even lowered their weapons. The human bodyguard's eyes did not leave the soldiers in front of him. He could see every movement and reaction. He seemed to predict what each soldier would do next. The diplomat nodded slightly, and the human bodyguard moved even closer to the enemy line. The soldiers froze completely, unsure if they should attack. The city square felt heavy with tension, but also filled with awe and relief. The children whispered in amazement and hope. Their parents stared with pride and disbelief. The enemy commander's hands shook as he tried to regain control. His voice faltered, and some soldiers ignored his orders. The human bodyguard stood silently, but his presence was enough to stop any attack. The diplomat's calmness gave him more power. The enemy soldiers could not believe that one human could hold an entire army at bay. Some whispered among themselves, "Is this real? Can one human really be this strong?" The city leaders held their hands together and prayed silently. They could feel the danger and the power in the same moment. The human bodyguard shifted slightly, his eyes never leaving the enemy army. He moved like a shadow, ready to strike at any moment, but did not overdo his power. Each movement was careful and precise, like a dance. The crowd gasped and whispered again. The diplomat raised his head and looked at the enemy commander with quiet confidence. His eyes told the commander that the situation was already decided. The human bodyguard took another step forward. The enemy soldiers froze again. They could not move. Their weapons felt useless and heavy. The children whispered to their parents about the amazing human in front of them. The city leaders exchanged looks of hope and amazement. The air was filled with tension and anticipation. Everyone could feel that the human bodyguard was extraordinary, and no ordinary soldier could match him. The enemy commander tried to shout, but his voice failed. He could see the fear and hesitation in his own soldiers. The diplomat stood tall and proud, while the human bodyguard remained silent but ready. The city square was filled with awe and disbelief as everyone watched the unfolding scene. The enemy army could not attack. The citizens could hardly believe what they were seeing. Their hope was rising higher and higher. The human bodyguard had shown them that a single human could control the battlefield and protect the city from almost certain defeat. The tension in the square grew even stronger as everyone waited for the next move. The diplomat's calmness and the human bodyguard's skill had changed everything, and the enemy army began to feel the fear that no one had ever felt before. The city square was tense and quiet as the enemy army hesitated. Soldiers froze in place and whispered to each other, wondering if they should attack or retreat. The diplomat stood tall in the center with the human bodyguard behind him. The citizens held their breath and watched every movement. The enemy commander frowned and clenched his fists as soldiers looked nervous and confused. The human bodyguard moved slightly forward. His steps were slow but precise. Each motion was full of control and power. The crowd could feel the strength in his presence. They whispered to each other in amazement and fear. The diplomat raised his hand, and the human bodyguard shifted his weight slightly, as if ready to act at any moment. The enemy commander tried to shout orders, but his voice trembled. His soldiers hesitated. The city leaders looked at each other with hope and disbelief. They could not believe what they were seeing. The human bodyguard's eyes scanned the battlefield carefully. He noticed a group of soldiers trying to surround him, and the diplomat, they thought they could strike before anyone noticed. He moved with incredible speed and intercepted them one by one. His movements were flawless and precise. He disarmed one soldier with a twist of his wrist. He pushed another back with perfect timing and knocked a third down without serious harm. The crowd gasped in awe. The citizens whispered, "Is he really human?" The enemy commander's face turned pale. He had never felt fear like this before. His soldiers looked at each other nervously, and some lowered their weapons. The human bodyguard stood silently, but his presence made the soldiers feel trapped. They could not attack or move freely. The diplomat nodded slightly, and the human bodyguard took another small step forward. The enemy commander swallowed hard and tried to regain control, but his voice failed. The soldiers began to whisper among themselves. Their confidence was gone. The city square felt heavy with tension, but also filled with awe. In relief, the children whispered to their parents about the amazing human in front of them. The parents stared with pride and disbelief. The enemy commander looked at the human bodyguard, and his fear grew stronger. He could not understand how one human could hold back an entire army. The diplomat raised his head and looked at the enemy commander with quiet confidence. His eyes told the commander that the human bodyguard was unstoppable. The human bodyguard took another step forward. His calm presence seemed to weaken the enemy soldiers even more. The citizens whispered again in amazement and hope. Their hearts raced with excitement. The enemy commander tried to shout again, but his soldiers ignored him. Some began to drop their weapons. Slowly, the city leaders held their hands together in silent prayer. Their hope grew stronger. The human bodyguard did not attack aggressively. He only controlled the battlefield with his skill and presence. Each movement was perfect and careful, like a silent warning. The crowd gasped and whispered. The diplomat's calmness gave him more power. The enemy soldiers could not believe what they were seeing. They felt trapped and powerless. The human bodyguard's eyes never left the soldiers in front of him. He seemed to know their every move before they made it. The diplomat nodded again, and the human bodyguard moved a little closer to the enemy line. The soldiers froze, completely unsure of what to do. Their weapons felt heavy and useless. The children whispered in awe and fear. The city leaders exchanged looks of hope and disbelief. The tension in the square was unbearable. but also thrilling. The human bodyguard had shown everyone that he was not ordinary. His skill and control were beyond anything anyone had seen. The enemy commander's face turned pale as he realized the battle was slipping from his hands. He could see the hesitation and fear in his soldiers. The diplomat stood tall and proud while the human bodyguard remained silent, but ready for anything. The city square was filled with awe and disbelief. As everyone watched, the citizens could feel the power of a single human in HFY. How it could change the fate of the city. The enemy soldiers felt their morale crumble. They began to whisper among themselves, and some slowly lowered their weapons. The children whispered excitedly, and the parents held their breath. The diplomat and the human bodyguard stood silently. While the enemy commander's fear grew, the soldiers could not attack or move freely. The crowd gasped and whispered. The city leaders felt hope for the first time. The tension was high, but the feeling of awe and amazement filled the square. Everyone knew that one human had changed the course of the battle, and nothing would be the same. The human bodyguard's presence had turned fear into hesitation, and hesitation into surrender. The diplomat nodded once more, and the human bodyguard moved a little closer. The enemy commander realized that the human had already won the battle without striking a single final blow. The city square was filled with tension as the enemy army hesitated. Soldiers froze in place, unsure if they should fight or surrender. The diplomat stood tall in the center with the human bodyguard behind him. The citizens held their breath and whispered in amazement. The enemy commander's face was pale. He could not believe his soldiers were frozen by the presence of one human. The human bodyguard moved slowly forward. His eyes scanned every soldier and every weapon. He was calm, but ready for anything. The diplomat raised his hand slightly, and the human bodyguard mirrored his calm energy. The enemy soldiers whispered to each other. Their confidence was disappearing fast. Some lowered their weapons while others stayed frozen in fear. The city leaders looked at each other with hope. They could not believe what they were seeing. The human bodyguard's skill was extraordinary. He did not strike aggressively, but controlled the battlefield with perfect timing. Each step he took made the enemy soldiers hesitate. The crowd gasped and whispered, "Is he really human?" The enemy commander tried to shout orders, but his voice trembled. His soldiers ignored him or moved nervously. The human bodyguard took another step forward. His calm presence seemed to weaken the enemy army even more. The diplomat nodded slightly, and the human bodyguard moved closer to the front line. The soldiers could not move their weapons, felt heavy and useless. The city square was tense and quiet except for the sound of shallow breathing and distant footsteps. The children whispered to their parents about the amazing human in front of them. The parents stared with awe and fear. The human bodyguard's eyes never left the enemy soldiers. He seemed to know every movement before it happened. The diplomat raised his head and looked at the enemy commander with quiet confidence. His eyes told the commander that the human bodyguard would not allow any attack. The enemy soldiers began to whisper among themselves. Some slowly dropped their weapons. The city leaders held their hands together and prayed silently. Their hope grew stronger. The human bodyguard moved a few steps closer, and the enemy soldiers froze completely. Their morale was gone. The diplomat stood calmly, while the human bodyguard controlled the battlefield. Without striking, the citizens could feel the extraordinary power of a single human. The children whispered in excitement and fear. The city leaders exchanged looks of amazement. The tension in the square was unbearable, but thrilling. The enemy commander's face turned pale as he realized he had lost control of his army. His soldiers looked at each other nervously, and some even stepped back. The diplomat raised his hand slightly, and the human bodyguard stepped forward with perfect precision. His movements were slow, but full of power. The enemy soldiers felt trapped and unsure. They could not attack or retreat. The human bodyguard's eyes scanned every soldier carefully. He was ready to act instantly if anyone moved. The city square was filled with awe and disbelief. The citizens could not believe one human had such control. The enemy commander realized that the battle was over without a single strike. The soldiers began to surrender slowly. The human bodyguard did not force them. He only showed his power through presence and skill. The crowd gasped and whispered excitedly. The diplomat remained calm and proud, while the human bodyguard stood silently, like a shadow ready to defend or strike if needed. The Enemy soldiers laid down their weapons one by one. Their confidence had completely vanished. The children whispered to their parents, and the parents held their breath. The city leaders felt relief and amazement. At the same time, the human bodyguard's presence had turned fear into hesitation and hesitation into surrender. The diplomat nodded again, and the human bodyguard took a few steps toward the enemy commander. The commander's face was pale with shock. He realized that one human had stopped an entire army. The citizens whispered in awe. The city square was filled with a mixture of relief and disbelief. The enemy soldiers had surrendered without a fight. Their weapons were on the ground, and their faces showed fear and amazement. The diplomat stood tall and proud, while the human bodyguard remained calm and silent. The children whispered about the incredible human who had saved the city. The parents stared in amazement. The city leaders held their hands together and breathed in relief. The human bodyguard's presence had changed everything. The enemy commander stepped back and raised his hands in surrender. The crowd gasped and whispered the city was safe. The diplomat nodded once more, and the human bodyguard stood silently scanning the battlefield. The citizens could feel that the city had been protected by something extraordinary. They could not believe that one human had stopped an entire army. The children whispered excitedly, and the parents looked at the human bodyguard with awe. The city square was filled with cheers and whispers of disbelief. The diplomat and the human bodyguard stood quietly as the enemy soldiers retreated. Their mission was complete. The city had survived. The human bodyguard had shown that one human could change the fate of many, and nothing would be the same again. The city square was filled with cheers and whispers of disbelief as the enemy army retreated. Citizens ran into the streets, hugging each other. Their faces were full of relief and amazement. The diplomat stood in the center with the human bodyguard behind him. The bodyguard's eyes scanned the city, carefully ready for any danger. But nothing came. The soldiers of the city lowered their weapons slowly and looked at the human bodyguard in awe. They could not believe how one human had stopped an entire army without striking a single fatal blow. The children ran to their parents, pointing at the amazing human in the square. Their parents held them close, but could not take their eyes off the bodyguard. The city leaders came forward and bowed deeply to the diplomat. Their voices shook as they thanked him for saving the city. The diplomat nodded calmly and gestured toward the human bodyguard who had done the impossible. The citizens whispered among themselves, wondering who this human really was. They had never seen anyone with such skill, calm, and power. The diplomat spoke, quietly explaining that some humans were extraordinary. They had strength, intelligence, and courage that no machine or army could match. The crowd listened in amazement and slowly realized that the human bodyguard was one of these rare humans. The enemy soldiers had retreated completely, but some stayed behind, watching from a distance. Their faces showed disbelief and fear. They whispered to each other about the human who had stopped them. The children whispered to their parents about heroes and bravery. Their parents nodded in agreement, but still could not believe what they had seen. The diplomat and the human bodyguard stood silently for a moment. The sun was high in the sky, and the city square was bright and warm. The citizens felt a mixture of relief, joy, and awe. They had survived something impossible. The city leaders asked the diplomat many questions, but he only smiled calmly and said that the human bodyguard's mission was complete. The bodyguard did not speak. He only nodded slightly and walked slowly through the city square. His eyes scanned the streets as if he could see everything. The crowd parted and whispered, "Is he really human?" The children ran alongside the streets, trying to see him closer. Their parents followed, quietly holding their hands. The diplomat watched the human bodyguard with pride. He knew the world had changed in just a few minutes because of one human. The city square was still filled with whispers and excitement. The citizens shared their stories with each other about the incredible human who had saved them. The enemy soldiers returned to their camps and reported what had happened. Their commanders could not believe that an entire army had been stopped by one human. The diplomat turned to the city leaders and explained that humans had qualities that could change history, even without massive armies or weapons. The city leaders nodded slowly. Their faces showed understanding and respect. The human bodyguard stopped near the edge of the square and looked back at the city. He had done his mission, and now it was time to leave. The children ran to wave at him, but he only nodded and gave a small gesture of acknowledgement. The citizens whispered in awe and amazement. They had witnessed something extraordinary. They knew that one human had shown them the true power of courage and skill. The diplomat walked quietly beside the human bodyguard. Their presence alone had changed the hearts of the soldiers and citizens. The enemy army had been stopped, and the city was safe. The city square slowly returned to normal life. But everyone felt different. They had seen a hero unlike any other. The human bodyguard had shown that one human could change the fate of many. The children told their friends about the brave human and the calm diplomat. Their parents told stories of courage and hope that would be remembered for years. The city leaders promised to honor the human bodyguard in their records, but he had already disappeared into the streets, quietly, leaving only whispers of his presence. The diplomat nodded once more and turned to leave. The city was safe thanks to one human and the courage of a calm leader. The citizens whispered and pointed at the empty streets where the human had disappeared. They felt a mixture of relief, admiration, and curiosity. The children asked their parents if they would ever see him again. The parents smiled, but could only shake their heads. The city had learned a lesson about courage, skill, and the power of a single human. The human bodyguard had shown them that one person could make a difference even against impossible odds. The diplomat and the human bodyguard walked away quietly into the horizon, leaving the city safe and changed forever. The citizens would remember this day as the day humanity showed its true power. The children would grow up telling stories of the human who saved the city without a fight. The city leaders would never forget the calm strength of the diplomat and the extraordinary skill of the human bodyguard. The square was quiet now, but full of wonder. Everyone knew that the human bodyguard had changed history in just a few minutes, and his legend would live forever.